Jetsons 1963 issue 14. George drives over to the backwoods where his cousin Jethro lives with his family. Jane says George should have given him a call first, and he assumes he doesn't have a phone, even though this is the future. They had all of this technology in the series, and they somehow couldn't predict cell phones. He wonders how he can find directions to Jethro's place, and even a kid like Elroy assumes the sign has bullet holes in it, because apparently there's still people using guns in a world with ray guns. Jane thinks they should go home, and they get threatened by people with silly looking weapons, and one of them is somehow stupid enough to call their Great Dane a horse. The guy says they'll take them to Jethro, with his smirk making it obvious that he's evil. They get into their car and it lands, there's some boring padding, and eventually George sees his cousin, who I don't recognize. Why did they give him the same name as the old farmer if it's just going to be confusing? He tells his mother to cook some more for the family, and somehow Jethro calls Astro a horse too. Eventually there's a warning signal, and he grabs a weapon and tells George to imitate him. And some bad guys drive towards them in a flying car shooting. George hides, which is smart, while this guy's just begging to get killed, or face court charges if he actually gets a hit. He's disappointed in George, who tells him that beauty is no way to live, as if he somehow thinks it's something he's doing wrong, when these guys were trying to drive by and shoot at his house. Clearly they can't be reasoned with. He says he doesn't even know his neighbor's name, because clearly this is a parallel universe from the earlier issues. He says he had a slight disagreement with his neighbor once, but nothing was made of it. So he tells Jethro to visit his house with his family. Jane again thinks he didn't do something wise. She gives the twists away just by complaining, because she's right too often. She says some boring things that cause George and her to put down a ton of cots to account for the fact that George invited a lot more relatives than he expected. Judy tells George that their neighbor is visiting relatives too, and wants some of his cots. And George agrees. Then Jethro finds out their neighbors are the Jetsons, and the story ends with George driving away to the boondocks, and somehow having a conversation with his neighbor when the two of them have their air domes up in their cars, and their cars tend to go into space too, so why would they not be soundproof? This would only make sense if they were talking to each other via radio because they had microphones in their cars, and they had each other's numbers. If their bubble helmets in space have microphones in them, that would explain people being able to converse in space. It's annoying that the story ends the way it does. It would be annoyingly sappy and feel too unlikely if the feud got ended. But this way I feel like the story ended in the middle. It was all a big waste of time for George, with the only thing he got out of it being a good meal to eat at his cousin's place. In the next story, George is bored of button pushing, somehow having only 2 buttons to push in his job without a screen to tell him what to do. And he sees someone with what he thinks is an exciting job rocketing all over the universe to stay in hotels. He hopes he'll substitute for him in that job if he makes it look exciting. And somehow his plan works, and he gets given $5 to let Jeff try it. Somehow he gets excited over $5. To be fair, we don't know what the future holds for the value of US currency. It just contradicts a story that must be in a different universe from this one. Spacely realistically calls him out on deserting his button, only to call him an amazing salesman for talking Jeff into doing his job. George thanks Spacely for complimenting him, and ends up driving in space with an assignment to sell sprockets to a cold planet. He says the planet's so slippery from ice that he made 20 orbits trying to coast to a stop. He should have gone back into a hover and stopped a long time ago. I'm sure it'll save a lot more on gas than this. I guess the planet has artificial gravity to make up for being so small. He also had no common sense because he doesn't have winter clothes when he's going outside on a planet called Arcticus, which either must have been founded by Earthlings because of its name, or this is just the name Earthlings call it. He sees the natives who look like Earthlings slipping on the ice too. Wouldn't they wear shoes to make it less likely that they'd slip? In fact, why don't they use hover shoes all the time like Elroy with the Space Scouts? I guess because those only have so much battery and they'd have to be replacing the batteries all the time, which is too expensive. Somehow, the entire planet only has one hotel, which would only make sense if it was really recently colonized, which is believable as these are Earthlings, and an ice planet doesn't seem like an appealing place to live. I was expected to see aliens adapted to this climate. George really came unprepared because he should have had hover shoes. But if there wasn't any slipping and sliding, there'd be nothing happening in the story. There's no heating in the hotel because it's made of ice. That's completely ridiculous. Every building would be made of normal building materials so it could have heating in a cold place. Igloos exist, but no hotel would be made of ice. It's too big and trying to accommodate too many people. He wonders where the factories are and finds out they don't have factories, despite being descended from Earthlings. And they all make their own stuff here. Why was he sent to a planet like this to sell sprockets then? A brutally unfair test of a brand new salesman because even an expert would have trouble. This guy doesn't want clothes, appliances, and gadgets. They all have clothes. And the same type of clothes as normal people. George thinks about sprockets in the streets while showing them off and gets apathetic, derisive insults because their ancestors didn't bring technology with them when they came here from Earth for some reason. He doesn't point out what makes them valuable, and someone smart enough to say they have no need for useless things when told they could be souvenirs. He slips and drops the sprockets, and the ones with the more pointed teeth give him an idea. He drives to Spacely and gives him an idea to go with him to the people there, and we see one of them sitting on a sprocket bike. And there's a couple sitting in a vehicle with sprocket wheels. Somehow, I don't think sprockets would make good wheels. They're narrow, so they wouldn't let them steer very well, for one. And there has to be a reason we don't have every car wheel in that shape, when it would actually save on money that way because they'd have less material in it from the indentations in it. Then Spacely expects George to sell sprockets to the people on a hot planet. Why doesn't he just send him to normal planets instead of being as sadistic as possible? If he hates him that much, he'd fire him. You'd think he would want to reward him for accomplishing the impossible. Instead of us getting to see a story about that, George wisely quits the job and goes back to his job, saying he'll never envy another person's job again. I doubt that'll last. Then there's a comedy page where Elroy finds it exciting that George's car avoids a floating rock in space. Then Elroy gets bored of a roller coaster and says he wants to go back in the car. Why would George be so reckless as to drive so close to the floating rock in space so he can narrowly avoid it when his son's in the car? There's another one where George complains about the umpire when watching a baseball game because he was safe and says to throw the umpire out. Somehow the umpire thanks George for the suggestion, and George compliments two-way vision. The whole concept makes no sense. Wouldn't everyone be shown the same broadcast? There'd be chaos if anyone watching could alter it. It also makes no sense that the umpire can get thrown onto George. In the next story, Elroy compliments George on taking him to the space zoo, which has a Martian monkey. And Elroy complains about litter when it's clearly a four-leaf clover. He wouldn't have thought a plant was litter. The lion cage somehow ends up opening, and George tells Elroy considerately to hold still because his shoe is untied, and tries to tie Elroy's shoe, even though I don't see shoelaces on his shoe. It looks like he just wears overalls that end all the way down to his feet, making me wonder why he puts up with having to take them off every time he wants to use the bathroom. The lion jumps over George and hits a tree, rewarding George for trying to help his kid. Their vehicle has engine trouble outside the space bank. I don't get why it's called Space Zoo and Space Bank when these people still need air helmets sometimes. So it's not like everyone's a robot so they won't need to breathe. And they don't always have air helmets, so they're not in space. George sees a robber run out of the bank and drives into him. I get sad, wondering if he would have been punished for this in the real world, regardless of the fact that he had to do that to stop the robber. George and Elroy do talk about the possibility that they'll get rewarded, actually. Jane says these things could have just been coincidences, and I'm guessing this means she's right, because when it's a George story, God forbid she ever be anything but right. Don't have characters do this, it just ruins the surprise. There's a needlessly depressing, horribly written panel where somehow the park supervisor lectures George on attacking a toothless old lion. Boo-hoo. As if it could ever be blamed on him that the lion clearly ran into a tree. Who would ever think a regular human could knock out a lion, let alone have the courage to try? Even if he did, it'd be blatantly obvious that he'd have only done that in self-defense against something that had no business being out of his cage, when it's so obvious he'd be a danger to everyone around it, teeth or not. Lions have claws, so obviously it'd still be a threat without teeth. Him bitching at him would only be believable if it was a dream. I'm not reading his dialogue anymore. He should be bitching out the people who work at the zoo for being so incompetent that the lion was able to escape. I guess the rest of the story will suck. The president of the space bank tells George he lost his job somehow because of what George did, instead of what he did. The supposed crook was somehow his bank guard who was running out with the bank money on his way for help, and the fellow dressed as the guard was the real crook. This is a very silly thing that would never ever happen. I think the writer had a bad day. At least George left the room when he was being bitched out. George trails off and then finishes what he had to say by throwing away the clover at the zoo. So that would have been weird from Elroy's perspective. At least he wasn't a jerk by giving it to one of his enemies. In the next story, Rosie dusts George and says her job's so routine that she does it without looking sometimes. She gets told to fix dinner and calls her life boring. George says eating those push-button meals bores him lately, and asks for some whole, fresh, natural canned food instead of capsules. As if there's nothing but capsules from the Food-O-Matic now, because it's another universe. Rosie's sent to the 20th century supermarket that's still in the future, with a robot asking a teller for change for a Martian nickel. I really wouldn't expect Mars to have different currency. Well, I guess it's because it's a different country, despite being founded by Earthlings. She says she'll need some Martian cents from the head teller, and the robot steals money from a drawer while she's gone. Wouldn't there be a camera to catch this? Either he's a moron or the builder of the bank was. This robot wasn't counting on crashing into Rosie, and the narration explains that she was so bored that she wasn't even watching where she was skating. Rosie expects an apology when she made the mistake because she's the kind of bad person who's like that in this universe. She says that he can't talk with a can in his mouth, and insofar that's hard to grab. So her efforts push the can down the hatch, and she says it'll be awful to have the can jammed in his gears. Then a cop runs over to her saying there's no dancing allowed on the streets, even though I don't see any yellow lines on the road to indicate that cars are supposed to be driving on this white street. So they're on the sidewalk, but obstructing the sidewalk is still legal. What's worse is that he calls them tin heads like a bigot. It is only the 2060s. Rosie's too distracted to call him out because she recovers a bunch of dollars from the robot's mouth. For some reason, the robot punches the cop and gets in trouble when he could have just said the money belonged to him and he was storing it in there. So Rosie hits him with a bag of groceries and calls him out on being unfair for hitting a human. You'd think it'd have been restricted by the laws of robotics. I get giving robots some free will if they're built to be able to do any job they want, because that's mandatory for it, but there would be no benefit to not providing a restriction to keep them from hurting a human. The story ends with her happily reading the newspaper story about her catching the bank robber. The comedy page has George's uncle call him by the video phone, but it's not coming in clear. So George calls the operator to complain about the reception on his teleceiver, as opposed to the video phone, because this is a separate machine from that one. He complains that there's lines up and down on his screen when he talks to his uncle, and it's because he was talking to some from the state prison. He never would have thought the bars were anything but prison bars. The first story is about George finding out that his cousin is wrapped up in a family feud for the first time because he doesn't visit him. And apparently this never came up over any phone calls. And he completely fails to stop the family feud. And it turns out his neighbor is a member of the family that he was feuding with. It feels like a pointless story if it didn't resolve the feud, even if it would be unrealistic if he did. I thought the jerks that were smirking earlier when he first landed in the backwoods place would be villains. That would have been more interesting for a story. The next story is George trying to sell sprockets on a planet that doesn't want any sprockets. Even though it's confusing because they're all humans, so you'd think their ancestors would have brought Earth technology with them. But it was interesting to see how an ice country would be, with them slipping. And I like how genius his plan was, to actually get them to want sprockets. And then there's a horrible story where, well, at first it seems like a clover gave George a lot of good luck. So it's a great story at first. The ending ruins it, because it turns out somehow all that stuff got people to yell at him because of ridiculous coincidences. Like the park ranger convincing himself that George knocked out a lion instead of a tree, and yelling at him even though it's still obvious that it was a dangerous animal and he was justified. And plus it's completely ridiculous what excuse they come up with for the fact that it wasn't a bank robbery stopped. We're supposed to believe the clover doesn't even do anything, but it comes off like it gives bad luck, so it doesn't even tell the right message. And then there's the story where Rosie stops a robber. I like that she does it in a creative way, completely by accident.